In the episode right before this one, we talked about how to get the most out of the guest appearances that you do on other podcasts so that you can actually see an ROI for your efforts. And in this episode, Kelly Moser joins us back to talk about how to get the most out of the guests who appear on your show, including what is going through your guest's mind before an interview, during an interview, after the interview, and how can you as the host help them overcome any unspoken hesitations or objections that they might have so that they can show up fully to co-create a great episode with you that delivers for your listeners and that your guest actually wants to share. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Kelly, I am stoked to have you back and flip the mic around this time and really be thinking about what is going through your guest's mind when they come on your podcast. What do we as hosts need to be thinking about to really optimize this experience for our guests, to get them excited about their episode, to make them feel comfortable, to get them to actually share the episode at the end of the episode. So let's dig right in. Where would you suggest we start when it comes to thinking about what might be going through our guest's mind in terms of preparing them for the interview that we're about to have?
This is such a good question. I'm so glad we're getting into this because I think as a host, you assume that I know that I get nervous as a host sometimes thinking about what I'm going to ask my guest and making sure that I'm asking the right questions. And then also when I'm guesting, sometimes I'm still nervous, even though I've done a million podcast episodes. I think we sometimes forget that the other party is probably a little bit nervous. So no matter how many episodes they've done, even if they're a world-renowned speaker, every experience that they go into, they just want to make sure they're doing a great job. And actually, so we've been training guests for years. And I asked my students one time, I said, before you knew what to do, why didn't you share your episodes? Because that's one thing that I hear from podcast hosts all the time is that my guests came on my show. They never followed up. They never promoted the episode. It's so frustrating. And what it turns out is that the guest just felt like the number one reason that they didn't end up promoting an episode is because they didn't think they did a great job on the episode. It wasn't that they were ashamed of the podcast that they were on. It wasn't that they wanted to ghost the host. It was none of those things. It was that they felt like they did not have their very best conversation and they were ashamed of that and they didn't want other people to hear it. And I think if we understand that the more comfortable your guest feels and the better your guest feels about how the conversation went, that means they're going to be excited to share it. So there's a lot we can do to make sure that our guest feels prepared and calm. Even if they seem prepared and calm when they get onto the episode, the number one thing they're concerned about is what if they ask me something I don't know the answer to? Or what if one of their questions catches me off guard and I don't show up as my best self? And then if they feel like the interview doesn't go the way they were hoping it would go, they're not going to share. So it benefits all of us to make sure that the guest feels really comfortable and confident going into it.
This is so insightful. I am a perfect example of this because people will compliment me all the time and say, Courtney, you have the perfect voice for podcasting. Courtney, you're so poised. You're so polished. You show up so well. Anytime I speak from stage, people are lined up to talk to me. And I'm not saying that from an ego perspective. I'm saying that because I'm going to share a secret with you right now is that I do not often feel qualified to be speaking from these stages, to be showing up on these big podcasts and talking about these things. And that's just my own inner self-doubt, a little voice that we all have that comes up and says, who are you to be doing this? Mm-hmm. And so even people who are at the top or people who are on their way to the top, they still deal with this. And I'm just sharing this as a case in point story because there are those times, and this is why you have hit the nail on the head, where yes, there are those interviews that I've done where I didn't feel like my best self. I didn't feel like I shone in that interview, and therefore I'm embarrassed to share it. So Kelly, what can we do then to make our guests, to avoid that, to help them work through that objection, to make sure that they're comfortable? Because if you've got 20 minutes, 30 minutes, it's not a big container of time to really build and establish that rapport, especially if you don't know the guest who you're interviewing. So what would you suggest for us?
Absolutely. The number one thing you can do is prepare on your end and make sure that your guest is prepared too. And this can look as simple. We really need to talk to our guest about the content that we're planning on covering. So if you are the guest and you've, proposed the specific episode idea, which hopefully your guests are doing the same for you, they're coming to you with a fully fleshed out, well thought out podcast episode idea. That's not always the case. Sometimes you're reaching out to a friend that's in your network and you say, hey, let's record an episode together. But you log on that morning to record your episode and you realize, wait, I actually don't think we've really established kind of what our intention is for this episode. So having an intention, a point, Courtney, before you and I recorded this episode, we said, what are the things that we really want to make sure we land on? And because otherwise you're going to walk away from the episode feeling like you had more to give. The guest is going to feel like they had more to give. You're going to feel like your audience didn't really get the value that they wanted from this episode. So just aligning on a kind of a main topic. We in this episode we want to accomplish X. Even if that's the only thing you establish with your guest going into it, that's going to go a long way. Even better if you can share some potential questions with your guest that you might ask without and let them know, hey, you don't need to have prepared answers to these. These are just some ways that I can see this conversation going, because that's going to help the guest understand, okay, if we're going to be focused on these 5 angles, that means I can probably not worry and not prepare so much about these other things that sometimes other people ask me. It's just going to help your guest narrow down on what they have to focus on and sometimes refresh themselves on if it's been a while since they've done an interview. So just saying, hey, these are some topics that I would really love to hear your perspective on. How do you feel about these? And also give them the chance to say, number 3, really not my area of expertise. If we could avoid that, that would be great. Because we don't want to ask our guests something that they're not the expert in, because they're going to start to feel nervous. Their answers are not going to be great. That's going to make for not the best podcast, conversation, or episode. So just making sure that what you're going to cover, your guest feels really comfortable with. If there's anything that you say you might ask them, tell them, if any of this is not comfortable for you, let me know. It's absolutely no problem for us to take this out of the agenda. Just having a little bit of an agenda going in is going to, even if you don't do anything else, that is going to improve the quality of all of your guest interviews, I guarantee.
And the side benefit of that too is that it's going to make it a more focused and therefore more tangible and relatable and relevant episode for your listener, for anyone that is listening when that episode drops and anytime in the future. So what about whenever you actually are about to hit record? You get into the recording room, you're like, hey, how's it going? All right, we've got 20 minutes. Here's what we're going to do. And you kind of just give them like the rundown of like who the podcast is for. I mean, they should know that already, right? But it's like recapping. Okay. And then I'm going to record the intro and outro separately. And then we're going to hit record and we're going to go. Is there anything else we should be doing in those moments before we hit that record button to really make our guest feel like they're not on the spot, where they can feel like, okay, I'm confident, I'm comfortable, and I'm ready to go?
The number one thing your guest is worried about or thinking about right before you record is what happens if my brain goes completely blank and I cannot find the words that I'm looking for, or if I say the wrong thing, or if I completely stumble and flub. So give your guest a sense for what happens in that scenario. Just say, listen, I like to make a little joke out of it. I say, listen, you're going to do so great. There's going to be absolutely no need for this. But if your brain goes blank, or if my brain goes blank, here's how we handle that. So let them know, does your podcast get edited? What does that process look like? If they say something that they would love to suck back in and pretend that they haven't said, can they stop you and say, hey, can we just redo that last question? Like, is that okay? Let them know what is in bounds and what's out of bounds. If you don't edit your episode, let them know that too. But if you don't edit your episode, it's probably because you're someone who doesn't mind if they flub a little bit, because we're all human. We know that that's going to happen at some point. So either you're probably someone who wants the episode to be pretty clean, in which case you probably go the editing route. If you're someone who just wants them to sound like a person and you don't care if they mess up, or you have 10 seconds of silence as they think of their answer, let them know that too. That's just going to help them understand, okay, I understand what this person's expectations are of me. They might not expect me to make any mistakes. And then that's really helpful to know. Or they totally expect me to make mistakes. They totally expect this to feel like a natural conversation. And here's what they do about that so that the final episode still sounds really good. So help them understand just kind of the process, because podcasts are different. Some edit, some don't. Some, want you to be really deliver in one take. Others don't mind if it's a little bit more broken up. So give them that just comfortability that says, listen, the next 30 minutes, here's what's going to happen. If this mistake happens, if my alarm goes off, if your alarm goes off, don't worry about it. Help them understand exactly what your expectations are. And if something does go awry, or your internet cuts out, or your doorbell rings, because that's the number one thing they're thinking about is, I told my husband I'm doing this interview. I told my kids to not come bother me, but it might still happen. So just let them know what's going to happen if any of those things do occur.
Setting those expectations. You mentioned that, and I'm like, oh, that is so key. That is so, so key because it takes the pressure off. And then suddenly we're not like, okay, once the mic is on and now we're recording and now we're on and we have to like show up and be these perfect people, which we're not. We're humans, right? And we're going to flub and we're going to say stuff, letting them know what happens in that instant. I love that. So, Kelly, what about during the interview? Is there anything that we should be thinking about as hosts in order to really help our guests shine, aside from having our questions prepared, asking those questions, and maybe not talking too much whenever it comes our turn to ask the questions?
The number one thing your guest is worried about during the interview is, when do I know that I've answered the question sufficiently? When do I know that I've answered the question sufficiently? This is why, and I'm guilty of this too, this is why people ramble, because they're waiting for some sort of cue from the host to let them know that answer was sufficient. Now we can move on. They don't know when to stop. So if you can, even that's something you can also set up and address with them at the top before you record, is when I feel like the question has been answered really beautifully, I'll nod and give you a thumbs up. And that can be their signal to start winding down their answer. Because if no one's given you that signal that I feel satisfied with the answer you just gave me, they're going to talk and talk and talk. And that's the number one thing they're worried about, is I just don't feel like I've given a great answer, so I'm going to keep talking. Guests really struggle with just ending their sentences. It's the number one thing that all of my guests tell me. This is my number one feedback for myself when I'm listening to my podcast episodes. They're like, Kelly, I just feel like I go on. And now I'm starting to go on and on. So I'm going to cut it. I'm going to stop myself, Courtney.
I should be nodding and thumbs upping like, no, this is so good, Kelly. It's so, so good.
That just helps them feel like, okay, I gave a great answer, and now I can pause, and now we can move on.
Yes, because from the flip side of that, think about when you're guesting on a podcast. I know this is true for me, is that sometimes I'm asked a question and immediately my brain as the expert is going in 14 different directions as to how I could answer that, what we probably need to include in this answer, how to make sure I don't miss anything important in this answer, because I don't know what question necessarily the host has coming next, which they may touch on, but I don't know that. So I want to make sure I'm getting it all in and not leaving anything out, and therefore it wouldn't be valuable to the listeners. So this is really, really helpful. I love this. And in all of my years of podcasting, have never once thought to do this. So look, you're teaching me something now. Thank you for this.
Oh my gosh. You don't need any help, Courtney. You're just fabulous in every possible way.
Well, think about at the end of the episode, right? Because this is the part too where I feel like, okay, I'm always looking for what's that little 1% that I can improve and do something better. Because I know that's how I can have a better show for my listeners. I know that's how I can have a better experience for my guests. So at the end of the episode, what I typically do is I'm like, okay, this was awesome. Thank you so much. I don't have the exact date pulled up, but this is going to air in the next 4 to 6 weeks. We'll be in touch with the links, and thank you again for your time, right? And I probably am leaving something there, I'm sure, like there's money on the table, right, so to speak, where it's like there's probably more I could be doing in that instance to really reaffirm my guest, really make sure that they understand how grateful I am that they took the time to be here on the show. What else should we be doing at the end of the interview before all the post stuff and sending of the links and all of that good stuff?
Your guests really struggle to identify the highlights of the conversation. Because they're so familiar with the material, right? If they answered questions about the thing that they live and breathe for the last 30 minutes, it's hard for them to recognize where the wow moments are. So that's something that you can definitely reflect back to them, because once they understand what the wow moments are, then it makes it really easy for them to go and talk about the episode, because we all have been ghosted by a guest who never promotes the episode to their audience. And of course, it's not mandatory for them to do that, but it's kind of the unspoken expectation. You don't have to leave it unspoken. You can say, hey, it would really mean a lot if you could share this episode with your guest. And I know we send them assets and all that great stuff. And sometimes they still struggle to talk about it, because they'll say, I went on Courtney's show and we talked about podcast guesting. Your audience is going to be like, great, you talk about podcast guesting all the time. What would be more beneficial for Courtney, whose show I need to be promoting, and for myself, is if I say, I went on Courtney's show, she asked me such incredible questions. The one thing she pointed out to me at the end of the conversation that I don't typically talk about, and I realized after our conversation, I don't think I've ever shared it before, is X. And you as the host you understand your audience so well. You know what you've covered and what you haven't covered on the show better than this guest knows. So you're going to be able to identify what the mind-blowing, groundbreaking moments of your conversation are. Tell your guest what those things are, because that's going to make them feel like, oh, I did give a good interview. Oh, I did talk about something I don't talk about all the time. That's going to be the selling point for your audience. because they hear you talk about your expertise all the time. So if you can give them just that one thing that you haven't really talked about that much before, that's what's going to make them go and click on this episode, which is going to bring more listeners to Courtney's show. And that's, I think, something that a lot of us are missing right now.
This is so key. And then you can recap that in the email that you do send 4 weeks out, 6 weeks out. Kelly, is there a specific time frame that is too long to go by? Because I'm a batcher. I love to batch. I love to have these episodes done months in advance. But also, I know my experience on other podcasts is where if 6 months goes by and that episode is now old news, I'm not excited to promote it anymore. Is there a sweet spot there? And then take us into what should we be doing in order to recap and re-excite our guests when it comes time to actually send them the links and say, hey, it's go time, go share this out with your community.
Timing is so important, and it's such a, I think it's a block on both sides, because from the host perspective, you might be thinking, oh, I feel so bad. We recorded this so long ago. They probably don't even remember what we talked about. But then from the guest perspective too, I've also interviewed my students and my clients. And the number one reason after I didn't feel like the episode was my best material, this number two reason why they didn't promote is because whatever happened in the first week after they got all those assets, something crazy was going on. They hadn't really built in the promotional time into their calendar. And then 2 weeks later, they're like, okay, now I'm ready to promote, but I feel like too much time has passed. So on both sides, we're both thinking that too much time has passed. We've got to just get over that. The episode comes out when it comes out. The host can do their best to remind the guest that it was such a fantastic episode and you've been waiting, you've been so excited to release it. And then as the guest, if you can't get to it in the first day or 7 days or 14 days, that's okay. If you promote it 3 weeks later, that's still better than not promoting it at all. So I think we all need to just like let go of any guilt around, oh, it took too long, or, oh, I didn't promote this right away. Now it's too late. I've missed my window. Podcasts are going to be around. That episode's around forever. It's going to continue growing. People are going to continue listening to it. Promote it every 6 months if you can as a guest. Just, hey, remember that episode I recorded? Well, here's, someone just sent it to me again and I just got great feedback on it. If you didn't catch it when it came out, listen to it now. So there's no like, oh, it's my window has passed. The time has passed me by. It's never too late to publish the episode. It's never too late to promote the episode.
Because when you think about it, that content's evergreen. And I think a lot of times we date it inadvertently. And one of my biggest values is integrity. So I remember in the past, a lot of times I'd be like, well, 6 months ago when I recorded this episode, right? Because it's the honest truth. But at the same time, if I just left this out and said, when I recorded this episode with so-and-so, this is what we talked about. It was amazing, right? And it makes it that much more relevant and timely for whenever it is that you're promoting it, whether it be 6 weeks later or 6 months later, hopefully not 6 years later.
Yeah.
Kelly, is there anything that I should have asked you today that we didn't touch on that you'd love to leave us with in these last few minutes?
No, I think you asked wonderful questions, Courtney. I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation. I think it's like a little bit unexplored, untapped, but there's so much value in really optimizing the experience that you have with your guests, because it can be a little awkward for both sides. Both sides can feel a little insecure about how they're showing up before, during, and after. And the more open we can be and the more dialogue we can have with our guests and with our teams about how we're preparing our guests, the more seamless and comfortable the experience is going to be. And then that becomes something that they want to do again. They're going to refer great friends to come and be on your show because you made such an incredible experience for them. So yeah, thank you so much for having me to talk about this.
Thank you for being here and for making the time. For those listening right now who are like, okay, I need more of Kelly in my life, where should they go to connect with you?
Oh, thank you so much. If you are a host, just message me. I've got something really exciting coming up that will help you prepare your guests better for your episodes. If you are a host that's wanting to get more into guesting, I have a really wonderful free masterclass that I think would be really beneficial for you. And maybe we can include that link in the show notes below. It's like everything that you're going to need to know about organizing your podcast tour. And we talk more in the masterclass about monetization and really making sure that your listeners become leads. So that's something that I know we didn't get to go too deep into today, but that's something that we cover in depth in the masterclass.
I love it. Kelly, thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Courtney.
And if what you learned inside this episode was helpful for you, or if it made you think differently than you've been thinking or than you've been approaching your guest episodes to date, then I'd love it if you would scroll down leave a review and let me know. Or at the very least, tap the 5 stars on Apple or on Spotify. And then make sure you head to the show notes to connect with Kelly, because she is a wealth of information when it comes to the guesting side of podcasting, both being a guest and hosting guests on your show. And speaking of guests, don't go anywhere, because in the next episode, we're going to be talking about how to train your team to vet that influx of podcast pitches that hit your inbox and gracefully decline those that aren't a fit. Or if you don't have a team, how to establish your vetting criteria for those incoming pitches so that you know exactly which guests to accept on your show and why. And if you don't have guests on your show, but you guest on other podcasts, this is going to give you a lot to think about in terms of what other hosts might be looking for when you submit a pitch to be on their show. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.